Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Gareth. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me and see me okay from my sunny disposition of a hotel room in Harrogate this morning, because I'm giving evidence at a local plan examination in a couple of hours' time. So literally I will run across town at about 10:45 to pick up questions from the inspector. Nothing to do with solar. So I'm going to focus my energy and efforts for at least the next hour on that. My presentation could probably take, well, to be honest with you, it's me talking, could probably take 2 hours if I fancied it, but I think I'm going to target around 15 to 20 minutes, because I do want to pick up on what's been mentioned already about this being an opportunity for us to share some ideas, share some thoughts, trigger some discussion points for us to take offline and take forward as we start to build on the collaboration between our sectors to make sure we're making the best and most informed decisions. I'm going to share my screen now. It says with confidence. I hope everybody can see okay. As I said, it's 15 minutes or so, 20 or so slides. It's on the Prezi format, and I've already seen a question pop up about whether the presentation and this will be available afterwards. And actually, my presentation is on an online platform, and I can make it publicly available, so I'll be able to share the link with everybody if any of the interesting photos included in here are of interest. A couple of things. I do include a photo of skeleton of human remains, so that's just an early warning that will come in about 10 minutes into my presentation. The most important thing is, hi, I'm Rob Sutton. I'm Director of Heritage Consultancy at Cotswold Archaeology. I've been an archaeologist for nearly 25 years. A few of you on the call know me already, and some of you don't. I've been working on solar schemes for nearly 15 years now. Big ones, little ones, ones on tops of roofs, ones filling up large fields. Obviously very active in solar 10 years ago before it dropped off a little bit and came back again. I've probably worked on coming close to 500 solar farm applications across England and Wales, including the big NSIPs, DCOs in England and Wales. And without further ado, what I'm going to be kind of touching upon a little bit in this presentation is the challenges, the opportunities, what's new, what's changed, and what's planned. I'm going to do that by just picking up a few things that have been going on in conversations over the last few months on projects that I've been working on. And I give thanks to Wessex Archaeology and Mola Archaeology as well as my clients at Statcraft, Lightsource, Windell Energy and Low Carbon for some of the images and projects that I'll be talking about over the next 10 minutes. So the challenges, and I've obviously seen the answers that came up to the poll as well, and that reflects a lot of the things that I've been thinking about and I've been dealing with over the last few months or decade or so on this matter. And it's very specific, I think, to solar actually, in having sufficient confidence and understanding in the nature of the construction impacts, especially when we're dealing with something that is different from a normal development where wholesale destruction or loss of archaeological remains is the likely outcome. So getting a real decent understanding and a confident understanding on the variety of different stages of both construction, operation and decommissioning is one of the key challenges that I think is presented to us at the moment. Opportunities. Well, as picked up in, and I'll come on to this in a second, in government policy, there is a genuine opportunity for removing sites of archaeological interest from the ongoing destruction from ploughing regimes. I think there's the usual opportunities, if I use those words, for advancing our understanding in archaeological landscapes and archaeological remains. And as a result of that, improving access, which could be physical, but intellectual access to those remains too. What's new? Well, as I just touched upon, we've got an NMPS which picks up on the particular opportunities that I just referred to about removing sites from the ploughing, and I'll touch on this again in a moment. I think we do have a from my personal perspective anyway, a different relationship to some of the solutions that were put forward maybe a decade ago, where concrete footings uh, was was picked up quite regularly, and I think there are so like I said, a shift in relationships in the way in which we're thinking about the use of concrete on some of our solar sites. And I'll be straight, there is just a far improved collaborative working over the last few months and years on these things, um, as we're recognizing that we can be using solar to inform best practice and shifting patterns in the way in which we work on our sites. Screen's just frozen. It's not very clear, is it? It has frozen. I'll just get out of that second. Apologies for this. It's not happened before. There we go. Nope, done it again. There we go. So the concrete elephant in the room. It's not just about this, but it is in part, as I said, a trigger to the way in which we've been thinking about solar and archaeology. And I've been working on quite a few projects over the last few months where concrete feet was a solution to protecting buried archaeological remains in situ, and that has determined to be not the most viable and attractive option for consented schemes, as well as those that are just going through the planning process. So we have just been putting a lot of energy and effort in the last few months, 9 months maybe, to seeing if we can come up with better solutions to the proliferation of concrete. I'm not saying that concrete feet aren't a potential solution. We've just been really digging deep, pun intended, to see if we can find a better way to come up with better solutions for our schemes. As I mentioned, about what's also new, there's the position statement from Solar Energy UK, which at its heart mostly just picks up and draws from the way in which we should be looking to the NPS, which, as we know, is only drafted specifically for the national significant infrastructure projects, but actually picks up on and has been picked up on in town and country planning acts as being a material consideration for solar schemes. And some key messages actually that come through in that NPS that we can pick up and talk about this morning. There's a specific reference to impacts are generally limited in reference to solar schemes in EN3. Development may have a positive effect by removing site from regular ploughing, as I picked up on just now. The applicant should submit an appropriate desk-based assessment and, when necessary, field evaluation. That's be common and familiar to many of us because that's the same language that comes up in the PPF. Field studies, including investigative work such as trial trenching, again mirroring the things from NPPF. And another point in the EN3 that mirrors the NPPF, which is the extent of investigative work being proportionate to the sensitivity and the ground disturbance. But then another little specific one to solar at the end about the value in micro-siting to assist in avoiding unforeseen impacts and having flexibility in the design. And that flexibility in design, I think, is something we're going to pick up in discussions as well, because of the opportunities that could come from flexibility in design, but the way in which you can make better informed judgments when you really understand what's going to happen, and just balancing those two things. So just a couple of little slides with some images on it here for you. We've just got examples as I've managed to see on site, and maybe some of the audience have seen this as well. A couple of the piling rigs in action here, two different types of work. The picture on the left is when I was on site in Essex, where we brought a piling rig out as a demonstration to speak with some archaeologists and some other interesting parties to see how the construction process works. And the picture on the right is with the JCB pulling out, the excavator, excuse me, pulling out one of those piles as well. And I'll come back onto that in a moment. And just a different image below there, you see the way in which it's running across the grass surface. As a reminder, because we're going to be picking up these things as we go through our conversations today, a couple of little schematics there of the scale of the piles that were used in our solar farms at the moment. Two different types there. There are a variety of different types, but they're broadly all of a similar scale and similar type. They're measurements there in millimeters, so very small dimensions. There's a nice photo on the top right of one of the piles. In fact, that was from the image of the pile that we pulled out in the example I showed you before, and the hole on the left after the pile had been pulled out. The glamorous image of my foot on the bottom right there was after we'd stripped back the plough soil to see what kind of impact the pile would have had in the ground at a lower level. And my foot is actually on the top of an infilled prehistoric field boundary ditch. We intentionally put that pile through that ditch on purpose to see if we could recognize it after we'd stripped the topsoil back, to see if we could see the hole in the ground, the impact the pile had caused after we'd put it in and pulled it out. But of course, we're not just talking about piling. There's an image there to give you an example of one of the types of concrete pads, but that's another interesting example of the fact that that's just one type of concrete pad. There's all different types of concrete pad available, some of them considerably larger than that, depending on the requirements of the development itself. A nice little image in the top right of a typical cable trench with the cable running in it, and a really nice example on the top left there of the different solutions that are available regarding some of the access roads that go into our solar farms. This one being one that didn't require a dig solution, so just placed on top of a geotextile and then made up without the need for any ground disturbing works. So just to drill down into a few little examples of projects where solar and archaeology have come together, and I'm just going to use these as prompts for us to then pick up and have conversations as we go forward. I recognise that with our audience of 100 or so people on the call right now, we have a collection of archaeologists who are going to recognise lots of these things and recognise these images I put on the screen. But there's also planners and people who aren't regularly engaged in archaeology, and some of these images are quite abstract, so I'm just going to delve down quickly just to make sure everybody can understand what we're looking at. First image I've got here is for a large NSIP scheme in the northeast, and there's nothing special about the different colours on the left-hand side, but that just shows the extent of a large solar farm. As is traditional, a really detailed archaeological desk-based assessment with that project. The entire site, in fact, a little bit more than the entire site, because we were looking at options before we fixed the site red line boundary. So geophysical survey was extended across a very large landscape here. The little image in the top right hand side there, if you've never seen geophysical survey teams at work before, there's an example of a quad pulled cart undertaking the geophysical survey, which allows to get a really relatively good understanding of potential buried archaeological remains on a site. There was also handheld rigs for smaller land parcels, but it's quite commonplace to see that kind of bit of kit on the top right being used. And for those with a keen eye looking at this image, you might be able to see some tiny little green dots and squiggles on it, and they are the locations of the trial trenches that we deployed, a little over 200 trial trenches on this scheme, to further investigate some of the archaeological sites that were revealed from the geophysical survey. And the picture on the bottom right there is an example of what a trial trench typically looks like after the JCB or excavator is stripped back 1.8 to 2 meters wide, normally about 50 meters long, taking off the topsoil and plough soil down to what we call the natural, to see if we've got any exposed buried archaeological remains. And just going to zoom in a little bit now on these images to show you what it's looking like. So that those weird purple splodges for all the non-archaeologists out there are the results of the geophysical survey, and we call them anomalies. And sometimes they make patterns that look very obviously like types of archaeology. Sometimes they're a little bit amorphous and they're hard to understand. And we explored those further with those little green slots there you see, which are those 50 meter by 2 meter trial trenches. That we targeted across things that we expected to be archaeological remains, that might be archaeological remains, and other areas to test the quality of the geophysical survey too. In this case, some of those features turned out to be archaeological remains. In some of those cases, some of them turned out not to be. That's pretty normal. Here's another example from the same site, just zoomed in, where we've got, again, extensive remains being revealed on the geophysical survey, which we then tested via trial trenching. So all of that goes into informing the judgment on a project. Sticking with the north and going slightly further east and northeast up in Yorkshire, here's an example of a project where, again, we're able to do geophysical survey in advance of submission, and archaeological trial trenching as well to test the results of that geophysics. And with the desk-based assessment, we were able to conclude that there were remains of archaeological interest on this site, and those that were on the west-hand side of the site we excluded from development, and that includes excluding the compound from this area and any other types of potential ground disturbing works on the west side. And actually on the west side there were other reasons why we were going to remove solar panels and other development from that location. So different environmental constraints all came together to support a unified master plan. But also we had other pockets of archaeological interest across the site too, which we were able to safeguard by micrositing. We removed panels from certain locations because some of these remains we found were likely to be funerary. They were likely to be prehistoric, quite plough damage, but prehistoric burials. And working really closely with the local authority archaeologist up there, we come up with that scheme design. As I said, moving panels into different locations. There wasn't a substantial loss of panels through the way in which we moved and worked the master plan. The developer and client I worked with up there was able to still have a completely viable scheme through the avoidance of a few small discrete areas. This one is currently in construction. Sticking with the east of England, but going further south down into Essex now is another example of a nice little project whereby, in a slightly different fashion, the image on the top left-hand side for the non-archaeologist out there is the red line shows the limit of the archaeological excavation. The tiny little dots are the superimposed pile locations over the top of these blue areas, and these blue areas are the surveyed remains of ditch features. I'm just getting a message which says there's poor sound quality, so I hope everybody can still hear me okay. And these blue areas are the infilled ditch features of a Romano-British, about 2,000-year-old settlement site. And we didn't find many remains of buildings except one, which is just this little hashed area here. And we found the remains of a cobbled surface floor. Now, in effect, the archaeological strategy that was employed as part of the condition of this planning application was for a kind of pretty standard archaeological excavation. So we was exploring the archaeological interest, significance of the site. There were small-scale archaeological interventions, as we call them, sampling some of the features. So in this bottom image down here, you can see another perspective of that cobble rough surface, the floor of a barn, of maybe a 2,000-year-old barn, and just next to it you can see where the archaeologists have excavated part of one of those infilled ditch features. Now this site was excavated in its entirety, and in effect the site was then given back to the developers to build the solar farm without constraints. Here's an example of a slightly different scenario where an area had been identified on a geophysical survey as potentially including archaeological remains of interest, and it was excluded from the development with the possibility that we might use concrete shoes, but actually this was just kind of a no-dig zone. And in consultation and close liaison with the local planning authority archaeologist and with our client, we decided it might be a more cost-effective solution to actually strip back the site, explore the potential and archaeological interest. And in this case, we found the remains. And here's a plan version of that area that's been stripped on the right. It's about 30 by 30 meters, this area here, of a prehistoric or Roman period roundhouse. And that ditch is the outside eave strip gully, as we call it, which is where the water would run off the top and be captured in that ditch, that gully. And we explored the remains that were discovered, and As you can see, the vast majority of our piles across this site completely avoid any of the interesting archaeology. We carried out some small interventions where some of the piles were located closer to where the archaeology was, and we backfilled this and preserved it in situ with the piles going over the top. And we had a carefully controlled methodology so that the machines weren't tracking over the archaeology, so it's all protected nicely, and that's being piled as we speak. Another very similar example in Essex as well. Ignore the fact that it's pink, but here's a plan again of archaeological features that were discovered in a strip. That dot line is about a 30 by 30 meter grid that we stripped the topsoil back, and we found interesting archaeological remains. That line that runs through the middle there was the location of a trial trench that had been put in there a few months before, which had already given us the indication that there was interesting archaeology here. And in this case, we explored the remains that had been discovered. The image on the right is an upturned, that lumpy brown looking thing, is an upturned urn, probably a Bronze Age, so a prehistoric large pot. And it's likely that there's going to be the cremation remains of a human in there. And that was excavated in its entirety properly because it's just located quite close to one of our piles down here. We further investigated some of the other features which were close to piles. None of them had the same interest as that one. And again, like the previous site, we're going to carefully backfill and preserve that in situ and carry on piling. Second from last image now. There's that reference to the human remains on the right-hand side that I've alluded to earlier. This is an example in the West Midlands of a solar farm site. We have an archaeological excavation ongoing literally still on site as we speak today. Slightly different image on the left for those of you that aren't familiar with these kind of uses of image. This is a drone photo superimposed with the survey of the archaeological discoveries and the excavations. Now, in this case, all along the southern area and the west-hand side there were the access road and quite an extensive array of cable trenches. So we did full standard methodological approach to archaeological excavation through all of those areas. There are a couple of other locations where we did detailed excavations as well because we discovered and there was the potential for further burials. We've found about half a dozen now burials across this site, most of them very shallowly buried, some of them many damaged and truncated by ploughing, which includes the skeleton you can see on the right there, damaged relatively recently by ploughing by the looks of things as well with that case. And in the bottom right hand corner, example of one of the features we found as well, which is a Roman period 2,000-year-old corn dryer, and that T shape is the oven that they'd have used to heat the air to dry corn. In this particular example, when we superimposed the piles over the top, we've identified areas where we're going to try and preserve three of the four corn dryers and kilns we found on the site in situ, because they're not going to be interactive with any piles or any cables or any other construction activity. And in one case where there were a couple of piles close by, we're going to move those piles out of the way so we can preserve them in situ. So again, it's an example of working closely with the developer to see if we can come up with solutions that allow for the preservation in situ of these archaeological sites. Very lastly, an example of a project in Hampshire where we've adopted a slightly different methodology again, a rather abstract, curious looking image here, but that's an overhead plan of some archaeological features that were discovered first in a geophysical survey, which are our green squiggly lines and green blobs. And these lines here with the numbers on them were some archaeological trial trenches, which were excavated to explore interesting remains. And what that did reveal, including a little star there, was that we had some burials on this site, probably 2,000-year-old burials. And again, working closely in collaboration with the local authority archaeologist down in Hampshire, we devised a scheme where we're going to look at the locations in these long linear strips of where the piles go, every other pile, to see if we can identify any further burials as a form of mitigation before we allow and go back and build the piling rigs as they let the piling rigs come on and pile as planned. Now, that really was a whiz through of a few live projects we're working on at the moment, um, and how we're working collaboratively with the local planning authority archaeologists and with the developers and with the construction teams on site to come up with solutions that allow us to do all of the things that are important and are opportunities on these projects, which is identifying and understanding buried archaeological remains, um, and exploring ways in which we can come up with sustainable solutions for preservation in situ too. I'm going to stop sharing now and take a breath. Because the way in which I was sharing my screen and operating off one screen, I've struggled to keep track of time. I hope that was about 15, 20 minutes. How's that, Rachel?